Snow cut the sky into thin white blades the night they decided she was no longer worth keeping. The estate sat half buried under ice, its windows dark, its walls cracked like old bones, but inside the house there was heat, candles and voices that spoke too quickly about honor and debt. She stood near the door with numb fingers and a torn shawl, listening as if her life were a number being read aloud, because that was exactly what it was. Hunger was the excuse they liked best. Hunger sounded clean. Debt sounded serious. Honor sounded noble. But when she looked at their faces, there was no hunger in their eyes, no shame, no fear. There was only calculation. Her stepmother's gaze kept sliding to the ledger on the table, to the gold seal pressed into red wax, to the heavy purse that sat untouched but already owned the room. Every sentence they spoke ended at the same place, even if they pretended otherwise. Gold. They told her this was a chance, a finishing school, a safe future, a way out of the cold. They said her sacrifice would save them all, that sometimes a family had to make hard choices, that she would understand one day. She did not cry because crying felt useless in a room where nobody was listening. Her father avoided her eyes entirely. Her stepmother did not. The woman watched her with a strange mix of impatience and relief, as if a long, annoying chore was finally being completed. When the man from the city arrived, boots clean despite the snow, hands gloved despite the fire, the house fell quiet in the way it only did when something permanent was about to happen. The transaction was fast, too fast for something that was supposed to be painful. Papers were unfolded, terms read aloud in a voice that never shook, names signed with careful strokes. A ledger was opened and updated as if this were grain or land or livestock. The wax seal came last, pressed down with deliberate force, the crackle of it cooling loud in the silence. Then the line that froze her blood landed on the table like a blade. Payment first. The girl after. Nobody objected. Nobody hesitated. Her stepmother nodded as if this made sense, as if this was the proper order of things. That was when she understood the truth she had been circling all night. This was not desperation. This was preference. The door opened without a knock. Cold air swept in, snuffing one candle clean out, and with it came a presence that made everyone stand straighter without knowing why. The king did not announce himself. He did not need to. He wore black, not richly, not poorly, just correctly, like a man who had never needed to prove anything. Snow melted where he stepped, then froze again behind him. His eyes moved once around the room, taking in the ledger, the seal, the purse, and finally her. There was no hunger in his gaze either, but there was something else, something steady and unsettling, like recognition without familiarity. "I don't buy living things," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the room without rising. "I clear debts." The man from the city faltered, glancing at the ledger, then back at the king. Her stepmother's mouth opened, closed, then curved into a careful smile. She began to speak about contracts and necessity, about survival, about how this was the only way. The king lifted one hand and the room went silent again. He placed gold on the table, more than the purse, more than the ledger showed, more than the estate was worth. It did not sparkle. It weighed. The king turned to her then, finally addressing her directly. "You can leave," he said, not gently, not cruelly, simply as a fact. The room inhaled sharply, her stepmother stiffened, her father looked up for the first time all night. "You can walk away," the king continued, his eyes never leaving hers, "but understand this. If you do, they will sell you again. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next winter, but they will." He paused, just long enough for the truth to settle where it hurt. "This is the last time you get to choose." Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. No one had ever offered her a choice before, not a real one, not one that came with truth attached. She looked at her family, at the people who had wrapped greed in pretty words and called it love. She saw nothing there that would change tomorrow. She looked back at the king, at the stranger who had not touched her, not dragged her, not lied. Freedom and fear stood side by side and both looked honest. She stepped forward, the floor cold under her bare feet, and did not look back. Behind her, the wax seal cooled completely, and the purse remained on the table, heavy with a gold that would soon demand its price. The door closed on the estate, on the lies dressed as necessity, On the night she was almost sold as if she were already gone. Ahead of her waited warmth without comfort, safety without softness, and a man who had not rescued her but had done something far more dangerous. He had told her the truth. The snow kept falling as they left, covering tracks quickly, hiding what had been done. But some things could not be buried that easily. Choices once made remembered themselves. She thinks the worst is over, but in the next part she will learn that freedom without love can still feel like a cage, and the king's protection has rules that cut deeper than chains. Snow chewed the world into silence as the black carriage climbed the ridge, and for the first time in her life she realized quiet could be violent. Her family's house had always been loud with blamming voices and clinking bottles and the sharp scratch of a quill against debt papers, but this ride was different. It was the quiet you get when someone powerful has decided your story is finished and is turning the page. She sat with her hands in her lap, fingers split and raw from scrubbing floors on her knees, dress hem stiff with frozen mud, and she tried to hold herself like she mattered because the man across from her moved like everything already belonged to him. The king did not stare at her like a hungry man, and that made it worse. He looked past her, through her, like he was checking a measurement only he could see. His presence cooled the air, not with cruelty but with control, like a room where the windows are shut for a reason. When the carriage hit a rut she flinched, ready for a slap that never came. The king's hand lifted, not to comfort her, but to steady a silver goblet on the tray so it wouldn't spill. That tiny detail cracked her confusion wider than any shout. If he could be gentle with glass, why was he so cold with her? The gates of the fortress opened without a shout, iron teeth parting in the storm, and the estate rose out of the snow like a dark ship frozen mid-sail. Towers, stone walls, lanterns that burned with a blue flame that did not flicker in the wind. Servants waited in a neat line, heads lowered, faces pale, hands folded, all of them dressed in the same ink-colored uniform like they were part of the building. No one smiled. No one spoke. They just watched her as if she was a candle carried into a library full of dry pages. The king stepped down first, boots meeting snow with no crunch at all, and he offered her his hand. Not romantic, not warm, just a fact. You will move when I allow it. She took it because refusing felt pointless, but the moment her skin touched his glove her whole arm tingled, like her blood recognized a language her mind had never learned. He guided her through the main doors into a hall of black marble and mirrored metal, a place too clean to be a home and too grand to be a prison. And then he spoke at last, voice low, UK sharp like a quiet warning in a crowded pub. You are not here to perform. You are here to stay breathing, that is all. She swallowed, and the words she wanted to say, "Thank you, please, don't hurt me," got stuck behind the same fear she'd lived with for years. A steward appeared, older, eyes like ash, and bowed. "My king." The king did not look at him. Room, fire, food, 3 words and the house moved. It was terrifying how quickly everyone obeyed without being asked twice. She was led up a staircase that could have fit her entire old kitchen on one landing, past paintings of people with the same cold eyes as the king, past windows that were bricked from the inside, past doors with locks on the outside, and she began to understand. This place was built to keep things out, but also to keep secrets in. Her room was not a servant's closet. It was a suite with a real bed, thick curtains, a bath already steaming, and a table set with bread, soup, and meat so rare it almost looked alive. She stared at it like it might bite her, then her stomach betrayed her with a hard twist of hunger. She ate with shaking hands, waiting for someone to burst in and call her greedy, waiting for punishment for taking too much. No one came. Only a folded note beside the plate, sealed with black wax stamped with a thorned crown. You may leave this room when the bell rings at dusk. Until then, rest. Do not go to the west wing. Do not open doors that have ash on the handle. If you need anything, ring once, not twice. There was no signature. Of course there was. Kings did not sign orders meant for the unseen. She washed in the bath and the water turned gray with old grime and village smoke and the hidden rot of shame, and for a moment she felt clean enough to think. If her family had sold her out of need, why did the king speak like he'd cleared a mess, not bought a prize? If he was a monster, why did he give her rules instead of chains? She wrapped herself in the robe left on the chair, soft as sin, and she tried to sleep. But every time her eyes closed, she saw her stepmother's smile in the candlelight, the way her fingers pressed the wax seal with pride, not sorrow. Near dusk the bell rang, one deep note that vibrated through stone. She stepped into the corridor and a maid was waiting with a tray and downcast eyes. "This way," the maid whispered, and her whisper sounded like prayer. They walked through corridors that looped like a maze, and she noticed tiny things. Salt lines in corners, a smear of ash on certain handles, a faint smell of iron that came and went like a heartbeat. She tried to ask where they were going, but the maid flinched so hard she nearly dropped the tray. "Please," the maid begged, voice trembling, "don't ask questions in the hall, the walls here." That was not a joke. That was fear trained into bone. They reached a dining room with a single long table and one chair at the head. The king sat there already, candlelight carving his face into sharp angles, hands folded, gaze fixed on a ledger open beside a cup of dark liquid. He did not rise. He did not tell her to sit. She stood by the doorway until he finally looked at her, and in that glance she felt weighed, not judged. "You eat," he said. Not a question, she sat. Food appeared as if the air produced it. Warm stew, buttered potatoes, more meat, and something sweet she could not name. The king did not touch anything. He watched her eat like he was measuring time, and she hated how her body relaxed anyway because no one was mocking her for being hungry. When she finished, he slid a small velvet pouch across the table. It clinked coins, for shoes, for proper clothes. "Your hands need salve." Her throat tightened. "Why?" she managed, because the word pushed out before fear could stop it. The king's mouth barely moved. "Because I do not keep people in rags, that is peasant theater." She stared at him, unsure if she'd been insulted or defended, and he continued, calmer than the snow outside. "Your family told you they had no choice. They lied. They always have a choice. They chose gold." The way he said it made her skin prickle, like he was talking about a law, not a feeling. She thought of the night papers were signed, the line she overheard through the kitchen door, "Payment first, girl after." Her voice shook. "If you know they lied, why did you come at all?" His eyes lifted, and for the first time his calm looked like something else. Impatience sharpened into warning. "Because you were about to become visible," he said, and the candle flames dipped as if the room listened. "Visibility kills. In my world, being noticed is death." She did not understand, but the truth in it landed heavy. Then softly, like he was offering something precious and dangerous at the same time, he said, "You may leave. Tonight I will send you to the city with enough money to start fresh. No one will touch you under my name." Her heart kicked. Freedom. The word tasted unreal, and then his gaze went cold again. "But understand this, if you return to them they will sell you again. Not because they must. Because they can." Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. "So what do you want from me?" He leaned back, and the chair did not creak, and the shadows behind him seemed to deepen like they respected him. "Nothing you do not choose," he said. "Stay here, you are protected. Leave, you are free. But if you stay, you follow my rules. I do not bargain twice." It was the first time anyone had offered her a choice without laughing. Her mind screamed trap, but her body remembered what it felt like to be dragged by the wrist, to be pushed to her knees, to be told she was worth less than a sack of grain, and that memory answered first. "If I stay," she whispered, "am I your servant?" The king's eyes flicked to her cracked hands. "No, you will not kneel in this house unless you wish to pray." She almost laughed, a broken sound, and he stood, coat moving like a slice of night. "Dusk ends. Return to your room. Tomorrow you will see the library. You will learn why the West Wing is locked." He walked past her, and she smelled cold rain and metal and something ancient, and she realized he'd said learn like he expected her to survive long enough to use knowledge. She went back to her suite with the pouch of coins heavy in her palm, and she tried to calm the storm in her chest. On the desk, a second note waited, placed without anyone entering because her door was locked from the inside. "Your family signed more than one paper. They sold more than you. If you want the truth, meet me at midnight by the broken window on the east stair. Come alone." No seal, no name. Her stomach dropped. In the corridor the bell struck once more, a small sound like someone testing a chain. And from far away, deep in the West Wing, she heard a soft knock twice, then silence, as if the house itself had just warned her. Someone else knows she is here. She checked the door bolt again, then the window latch, then the mirror, because fear taught her to count exits. At midnight the wind changed, whistling through the stone like a voice trying to speak. She crept to the east stair and found the broken window just as the note said, glass missing like a torn mouth. A figure waited in the dark, not the king, smaller, breathing fast. "Don't scream," the figure said. "I'm on your side." A hand thrust forward a strip of parchment covered in numbers and names, a family ledger. Her own name was there twice. Beside it, a third line was blank, waiting, and in the margin someone had written in old ink, "Next sale to the Crown." She went cold. Not again. No. The paper shook in her hands as the wind pushed snow through the broken window, and in that moment she understood the real reason the house felt like it was holding its breath. This was not a rescue. It was a pause. The figure beside her stepped back into shadow, voice low and rushed, explaining just enough to terrify her without mercy. The ledger was real, older than her birth, and every name inside it had been moved like cargo from hand to hand, sold under excuses that sounded noble when spoken aloud but rotten when written down. Hunger, debt, honor, always the same lies. Her family's handwriting appeared again and again, neat and confident as if they were proud of their bargains. She felt sick, not because she had been sold once, but because they had planned to sell her again the moment the gold ran thin. The king had not dragged her away from danger. He had stepped between transactions. When the figure vanished, leaving her alone with the proof, she folded the ledger page against her chest and realized something colder than fear was settling in. Anger, quiet, focused, the kind that does not scream, the kind that survives. Morning came with pale light and a knock that never touched the door. Breakfast waited on a tray, richer than anything she had known, and she pushed it away until her stomach cramped. When she finally ate, it was because she remembered the king's words about breathing, about staying alive. In the library she wandered shelves filled with laws and histories written by victors who pretended they were kind. She learned fast because learning felt like armor. Servants watched her with curiosity and something like respect, whispering when they thought she could not hear, calling her the quiet one because she did not beg and she did not cry. At dusk the king found her there, reading a treaty older than the town that had spat her out. He did not ask what she had learned. He already knew. "They will come," he said, eyes on the fire, voice steady. "Not today, not loudly. They will come like paperwork." She showed him the ledger. He did not touch it. "Yes," he said, "that is the cage, not these walls." Her voice surprised her by not breaking. "If I leave, they sell me. If I stay, I disappear." He turned then, and for the first time his control looked like restraint, not distance. "If you stay," he corrected, "you become inconvenient." The word tasted powerful. He explained the rules again, not as commands but as survival tips, and she saw the pattern. Every protection came with a cost, every kindness came with a boundary. That night she dreamed of gold piling up in her family's kitchen until it crushed the table, and still they reached for more. She woke before dawn and knew what she would choose, not because it was safe, but because it was hers. At breakfast she said it simply, "I stay." The king nodded once, as if ticking a box he had prepared for. "Then we make you unprofitable," he said, and somewhere deep in the fortress, locks turned that had not moved in years. From the tower window she watched the road that led back to her old home disappear under fresh snow, and she felt the weight shift. The next sale would not happen quietly, because if she stayed, the king was about to ask her to walk back into the place that sold her and stand there without chains. The return did not feel like bravery. It felt like stepping into a memory that had teeth, because the road back to her family's estate looked smaller than she remembered, hunched under winter clouds, as if shame itself had bent the roofs and fences. The king did not ride beside her to comfort her. He rode opposite her to witness, calm and unreadable, his presence heavy like a verdict that had not yet been spoken. When the carriage stopped, there was no dramatic arrival, no thunder, only the crunch of snow and the familiar smell of damp wood and old fear. Her family opened the door with smiles sharpened by relief, eyes darting to the king's coat, to the insignia they pretended not to recognize, to the guards who did not dismount. They talked fast, tripping over excuses, about misunderstanding and necessity, about how hard things had been, about how everything they did was for survival. And she watched herself from somewhere far away, the girl who had once nodded along, who had once believed hunger excused cruelty. The king listened without interrupting, hands clasped behind his back, posture relaxed like a man at a dull meeting. And when the noise finally burned itself out, he stepped forward and placed a small chest on the table. It opened with a soft click, gold catching the weak light, coins stacked neat and heavy, more than they had ever seen at once. The room changed instantly. Shoulders straightened, voices softened. The stepmother's mouth curved into a smile she did not bother to hide. The king's voice cut clean through it. "If I return the gold," he said, quiet enough that they had to lean in, "would you sell her again?" The question hung there, naked and patient. They laughed first, nervous because laughter had always worked before. Then they looked at the gold again, then at each other. Words stumbled out, half jokes and half pleas, testing the air, and finally the truth slipped free because greed is clumsy when it thinks it has won. "If the price is right," someone said, shrugging like this was a market, not a life. "We are not monsters," another added quickly. "We have mouths to feed." The king nodded once as if that settled something. He closed the chest and slid it back toward himself, then did something worse than shouting or striking. He smiled, thin and precise like a line drawn under a sum. "Thank you," he said. "That was the answer." The guards moved then, not violently, just efficiently, pulling documents from coats, unrolling contracts stamped with seals older than the house, reading names and dates aloud so there could be no confusion. The family tried to interrupt, to argue, to cry, but the words were no longer for them. They were for the walls, for the neighbors who had gathered outside pretending to fetch water, for the town that had watched and said nothing. The king explained the law in plain terms, not as punishment but as consequence, and it was horrifying because it was fair. The gold they had accepted bound them, not to him, but to their own choice. Every coin marked them as merchants of flesh under ancient trade law, stripping them of protections they thought were permanent. No bank would touch them. No guild would trade. No neighbor would shelter them without risking the same mark. Their debts, real and fake, would surface all at once, and the town would do the rest because shame spreads faster than fire. She felt nothing like triumph, only a strange lightness, as if a weight she had carried since childhood had finally been set down. When her stepmother lunged, not at the king, but at her, spitting apologies sharpened by panic, the guard stepped in without being told. The king did not look at her family as they were escorted out into the snow, not arrested, not beaten, simply exposed. He turned to her instead. "You chose yourself," he said, not kindly, not cruelly, just true. Outside, the wind carried voices already changing tone, and she knew the town would rewrite its memory by morning, claiming it had always known, always disapproved, always cared. In the carriage back, she stared at her hands, clean now, steady, and understood the real punishment had already landed. Her family would live, but they would never again be able to pretend they had no choice. The fortress rose ahead, blue flames cutting through dusk, and for the first time it did not feel like a cage. It felt like a boundary she had helped draw. As the gates closed behind them, the king spoke again, softer this time. "This was the easy part," he said. "Now the court will notice." Because the moment the gold lost its power, the throne began to pay attention, and attention in his world was never free. Attention arrived like a slow illness, quiet at first, then everywhere at once, because courts do not rush unless blood has already been spilled. Whispers crept through the fortress in polite shoes, carried by letters sealed in unfamiliar wax, and visitors who smiled too much and asked questions that sounded harmless if you did not know how to listen. She felt it before she understood it, the way servants began to pause when she entered a room, the way eyes followed her in corridors that had once ignored her entirely. The king noticed too, of course, because nothing in his house happened without being counted, measured, prepared for. He did not warn her to hide. He did not flatter her with importance. He simply changed the rules around her, and that was how she knew something dangerous was circling. Doors that had once been open were locked. Routes through the house shifted. Guards doubled at night. The blue flames burned a shade brighter, humming like they were fed from deeper wells. She asked him once late when the library fire was low and the air smelled of ink and smoke, "Am I the reason they're coming?" He did not answer right away. When he did, his voice was level, honest in a way that did not comfort. "You are the reason they hesitate," he said. "That is worse." The first invitation arrived 3 days later, heavy parchment, careful script, a request for her presence at a gathering framed as courtesy. The king read it without expression, then handed it to the fire. "They want to see what you are," he said. "They want to decide what you cost." Her jaw tightened. "And you'll let them?" He met her gaze. "I will let them reveal themselves." That was how she learned the difference between safety and strategy. He did not shield her from the court. He placed her where the court would trip over its own hunger. Preparation became its own ritual. She was taught how to walk through a room without lowering her eyes, how to speak without begging, how to pause long enough that others filled the silence with their own mistakes. She learned which questions to answer directly and which to turn back like mirrors. None of it was about pleasing anyone. It was about surviving a room full of predators who pretended to be civil. On the night of the gathering, she wore black, not rich, not plain, cut clean and sharp like a blade that did not need decoration. The king did not offer his arm. He walked beside her, a half step back, and the message landed exactly where it needed to. She was not owned and she was not alone. The hall buzzed with polite cruelty. Nobles clustered in circles, sipping dark wine, smiling like they were bored, watching like they were starving. Questions came dressed as compliments: how fortunate she was, how brave, how unusual. She answered simply, letting the truth sit without apology. When someone asked where her family was, she said, "They chose gold." The pause that followed tasted sweet and bitter all at once. A woman with a crown too small for her ambition leaned in and murmured, "And the king permits this." The king answered without turning his head. "I don't permit choices," he said. "I witness them." The room shifted. That was when she understood the trap. They had expected a rescued girl, a grateful thing. Instead, they were faced with a woman who had learned how to choose herself in public. The court did not like that. Fear rippled under silk and jewels, because fear is what happens when rules stop working. Later, alone in the carriage, she finally asked the question she had been carrying since the snow night. "Why me?" The king looked out at the city lights, then back at her. "Because you were already surviving," he said. "I don't build from nothing." The answer did not soften anything. It sharpened it. By the end of the week, the invitations changed tone. Courtesy hardened into summons. Polite interest turned into audits, requests for proof, demands wrapped in law. The king showed her documents older than kingdoms, clauses that turned flesh into property if spoken the right way. "This is why they sell," he said, "because selling feels safer than standing." She watched his finger trace a line on a page and realized how close she had come to vanishing into ink. At night, a messenger arrived bleeding, a warning delivered with his last breath. Someone had offered a bounty, not for her capture but for information, names, habits, weaknesses. The king's house responded instantly, gates sealing, lights dimming, guards moving like a single thought. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury she had never been allowed. Instead, she did something new. She planned. "They think I am leverage," she said. "Let them." The king studied her, something like approval flickering and gone. "You understand the price," he said. "Good." He explained what would come next, not gently, not dramatically, just cleanly. The court would test her again, this time with a trial disguised as charity, a hearing framed as concern for her welfare. They would ask her to speak. They would expect gratitude. They would expect her to fold. She nodded. "And when I don't?" His mouth curved, almost a smile. "Then we will see who truly believes in their laws." The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cold, the kind of day that pretends nothing bad will happen. She dressed herself, hands steady, breath slow, and caught her reflection in the mirror. She did not see the girl who scrubbed floors on her knees. She saw someone who had survived being priced and had learned how to refuse. In the hall, the king waited, black coat, unreadable eyes. "One last thing," he said, stopping her with a hand that did not touch. "They will try to make you feel alone." She met his gaze. "I was alone," she said. "This is different." The doors opened. The court waited. And somewhere in the crowd, hunger sharpened into a plan that thought it was clever. Because when she speaks at the hearing, the court will learn that choosing gold over a person leaves a mark that even kings cannot erase. The hearing chamber smelled of polished stone and old promises, the kind of place where truth was allowed in only if it knew how to behave. Rows of nobles filled the benches, dressed in quiet wealth, faces arranged into masks of concern that did not reach their eyes. She stood alone at the center, no chains, no escort. Which was the first trick? Let her feel exposed. Let her speak from fear. The king did not stand beside her. He sat back, half in shadow, letting the room forget him on purpose. When the questions began, they came soft and sweet, wrapped in sympathy. Was she safe? Was she coerced? Did she understand the generosity shown to her? Each word tried to turn her into a gift instead of a person. She answered slowly, clearly, refusing the pace they set. I am safe because I choose where I stand, she said. I am not coerced because I am allowed to leave. A ripple moved through the chamber. That was not the answer they had prepared for. They shifted strategy, sharpening their tone, bringing up her family, her past, the transaction everyone pretended was unfortunate but necessary. She felt the old heat rise in her chest, the urge to shrink, to apologize for existing, and she crushed it down. They said it was necessity, she said evenly. But when asked if they would sell me again, they said yes. Silence fell, heavy and awkward. One noble laughed, a brittle sound. People say many things under pressure. That was when she did it. She placed the copied ledger page on the stone floor, letting it slide into the light. Names, dates, prices, the mark of the crown beside each line. They said it calmly, she replied, because they believed gold was a reason. The chamber breathed in as one body. That mark was older than law, older than excuses. Murmurs turned sharp. Questions flew, no longer controlled. Who authorized this? Who benefited? Who looked away? The king stood then, and the room remembered him all at once. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply confirmed what was already bleeding out. This is not an isolated case, he said. It is a system. Faces paled. Systems meant accountability. Systems meant mirrors. The presiding noble tried to regain control, declaring a recess, but the damage was done. Outside, the crowd had grown. Servants and merchants and guards pressed close, hungry for answers that tasted like justice. She walked out into daylight without flinching, the king beside her now, not shielding, just present. They will not forgive this, she said quietly. I don't need them to, he replied. I need them to remember. That night the fortress locked down hard. Messages arrived from corners that did not usually speak, offers disguised as threats, threats disguised as concern. The king read them all, then burned them without comment. She paced her room, energy buzzing, fear and pride tangled together. What happens now, she asked, because asking felt better than guessing. He told her the truth, as he always did. The court would fracture. Allies would shift. Some would try to claim her story as theirs. Others would try to erase it. And you, he said, watching her carefully, will become inconvenient in ways that last. She nodded. Good. The words surprised them both. Later, alone, she realized something had changed. She no longer thought of leaving. Not because she was trapped, but because she was choosing to stay until the end of something. Outside her window, the blue flames burned steady against the dark, and she wondered how many lives had been priced quietly under that same light. She touched the ledger page folded in her pocket, not as proof anymore, but as a promise. Somewhere beyond the walls, greed was already regrouping, sharpening itself for another attempt. She felt ready, because the court's next move would not come as questions or law, but as an offer so tempting it would test whether freedom could survive comfort. The offer arrived at dawn, which was how she knew it was poisoned. No honest thing ever knocked that early. A velvet-lined carriage waited beyond the gates, its crest unfamiliar but expensive, the kind that wanted to be recognized without explaining itself. The messenger spoke carefully, like someone stepping through glass. He said the council wished to make amends. He said they admired her courage. He said there was a place prepared for her far from noise and danger, a quiet estate, servants, safety, anonymity, everything she had been denied before, wrapped neatly as if it were kindness. She listened without interrupting because interruption was what they expected. When he finished, she asked one question. "And my family?" The messenger smiled, relieved. Their debts would be forgiven, their name restored. There it was, comfort built on erasure, safety that required silence. She dismissed him with a nod and watched the carriage retreat, the snow swallowing its tracks like it had never existed. She went straight to the king, not to ask permission but to share the shape of the trap. He listened, expression unreadable, then surprised her by laughing softly. "They are learning," he said, "too late but learning." He did not forbid her from going. He did not push her toward staying. He simply laid out the cost. If she accepted, the court would claim resolution. Her story would become a footnote. The system would survive with a new coat of paint. If she refused, the knives would come out quieter, closer. "Which danger do you prefer?" he asked. She thought of the girl she had been, taught that survival meant compliance. She thought of the ledger on the stone floor, of the way silence had cracked. "The honest one," she said. By noon, whispers had turned to movement. Allies she did not know she had began to appear, not pledging loyalty, just offering information. A merchant warned her of asset freezes. A guard hinted at a planned accident beyond the south wall. A noblewoman sent a note with a single line, "They will try to buy you again." Each message confirmed the same truth. Greed did not retreat. It adapted. That afternoon, the king convened a smaller council, one he trusted because it did not pretend to be clean. They spoke plainly. Names were named. Lines were drawn. She sat in the room, not as evidence, not as prize, but as presence, and watched powerful people choose between convenience and consequence. Some left early. Night brought its own test. Her family arrived unannounced, escorted, faces scrubbed raw with desperation. They knelt before the king without being asked, apologies tumbling out rehearsed and hollow. They cried, they promised. They begged her to come home, to end the trouble, to think of them. She stood there and felt the old pull, the ache of wanting it all to have meant something kinder. The king did not intervene. He watched her, giving space like a gift. She asked her family one thing, the same question that had already answered itself. "If the gold was returned," she said, steady, "would you sell me again?" They hesitated, just a beat too long. Then her father whispered, "If it kept us alive." She nodded, because that was honesty at last. "Then this ends here," she said, and turned away. Behind her the king spoke, calm as snowfall. "You have your answer," he told them. "Leave." After they were gone, she shook, not from doubt but release. The king offered her a chair. She sat, breathing through the aftershock. "They will escalate," he said quietly. "They always do when purchase fails." She looked up. "So will I." It was not bravado. It was a decision. Outside, bells rang across the city, signaling curfew, signaling control. Inside, she felt something else settle, heavier than fear and sharper than hope. Resolve. Because the escalation would come not with threats or blades, but with a public spectacle designed to turn her courage into entertainment, and force her to choose who she would be when the whole city was watching. The spectacle began before sunset, because humiliation works best when people can see it clearly. Notices spread through the city like a fever, stamped with seals and dressed as celebration. A public reconciliation, they called it. A chance for wounds to heal. A chance for the king to demonstrate mercy and for the girl to accept it. Stages were built in the square. Lanterns were hung. Music rehearsed. It looked like forgiveness. It felt like a trap tightening its rope. She watched from a high window as the crowd gathered, faces eager, hungry for drama they could pretend was justice. This was how power washed its hands, loudly. The king prepared without ceremony. No armor, no crown, just black, simple, final. He did not instruct her on what to say or how to stand. He only told her where the exits were and which faces in the crowd would matter. "They will try to frame this as kindness," he said. "Kindness that asks for silence." She nodded. Silence had been the currency of her childhood. She would not pay with it again. They entered the square together, not side by side, but close enough that everyone understood the alignment. The platform was dressed in velvet. The council members sat elevated, clean and distant. Her family stood to one side, dressed better than they had ever dressed for her, grief polished to shine. The master of ceremonies spoke first, words dripping with relief, praising the king's restraint, praising the city's compassion, praising the chance to move on. Then he gestured to her, inviting her to speak, to accept absolution, to fold herself neatly back into the story they preferred. She stepped forward and felt the city lean in. She spoke plainly because plain truth cuts deeper than ornate lies. She told them about the ledger, about the price, about the question that had been asked and answered. She did not raise her voice. She did not beg. She named what had been done to her and how it had been justified. Murmurs spread. Faces shifted. The master tried to interrupt. The king lifted a hand and the interruption died where it stood. When her family tried to cry again, the sound rang false. The king turned to them and asked, in the same calm tone he had used from the beginning, if the gold were returned. The square held its breath. Would you sell her again? They looked at each other, they looked at the council, they looked at the crowd. The pause was everything. Then her mother spoke, thin and terrified. We would have no choice. The answer landed like a blade, not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. The punishment did not arrive as thunder. It arrived as paperwork, as declarations read aloud, as trade doors closing in real time. The king announced sanctions that sounded boring until the effects rippled outward. Accounts frozen, licenses revoked, names struck from registries. No blood, no spectacle, just removal. The gold they worshipped became useless weight, binding them to a life no one would share. The crowd shifted again, unease replacing appetite. This was not entertainment. This was consequence. As the sun dipped, the king spoke one final sentence to the square. We will not pretend this was necessity. He did not look at her family, he looked at the city. We will call it what it was. And that was enough. The platform emptied. The music never played. Lanterns guttered out. People went home quieter than they had arrived, carrying a new discomfort they could not easily shake. Back at the fortress, she stood alone for a long moment, listening to the city settle. The king joined her not to claim victory, but to acknowledge the cost. They will not forgive this, he said. They will reorganize. She smiled, tired but steady. So will I. She understood now that power feared one thing more than rebellion: refusal, refusal to be bought, refusal to disappear. Because the next move would not come from the council or her family, but from a rival king who had watched the square and decided that the girl who could not be purchased was far too dangerous to be left alive. The warning did not come with horns or fire. It came with silence that felt wrong, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears and makes your skin itch. The fortress guards noticed it first. Birds vanished from the outer walls. Torches burned lower even though the oil was fresh. The king felt it in his blood before anyone spoke the name. Another crown had turned its gaze toward the valley. Another ruler had decided that mercy was weakness, and that the girl who survived gold was a threat that could not be negotiated with. She was in the East Hall when the messenger arrived, not running, not shouting, just pale and shaking like his bones had already accepted what his mouth was about to say. A rival court had crossed the border at dawn, not an army, something worse. Envoys with smiles and contracts, assassins hidden inside diplomacy. They wanted a meeting. They wanted custody. They wanted the girl presented as proof that the king's rule had grown soft. The message was polite. The intent was murder. The king did not tear the parchment. He read it twice. Then he handed it to her. That alone was a shift that the court felt like an earthquake. They want you, he said. They think you are leverage. She read the terms and laughed once, sharp and humorless. They still think I'm a thing, she said. He watched her closely, measuring not fear but readiness. They will come for you even if we refuse, he replied. This is the moment where hiding stops working. Preparations began that night, not for war, for exposure. The king ordered the ancient seals brought out, the ones that had not been touched in generations because they revealed too much. He called witnesses who had been erased from records. He opened ledgers that proved how many lives had been bought quietly to keep peace loud. The court murmured, some loyal, some terrified. Power hates daylight, but it fears it even more when daylight is controlled. She trained with intention, not weapons, but words. She learned how to stand where everyone could see her without shrinking. She learned which truths would fracture alliances and which would fuse them. She learned how to refuse without sounding defensive. The king corrected her gently, never touching her posture, never claiming ownership of her voice. "They will try to make you angry," he said. "Anger is easy to dismiss. Clarity is not." When the rival delegation arrived, the hall filled with perfume and polished cruelty. Smiles too wide, compliments that tasted like threats. They praised the king's restraint. They praised his civilization. Then they turned to her and spoke of protection, of honor, of how dangerous it was for a girl like her to be exposed. "Come with us," they said. "We will keep you safe." She looked at them and saw the same hunger she had seen in her family's eyes, just dressed better. The king allowed her to answer first. The court held its breath. "You mistake me," she said, calm and steady. "I am not exposed, I am visible." The words rippled. The envoy's smiles faltered. She continued, naming the deals they thought were secret, the payments they had made to keep certain bloodlines quiet, the disappearances that had been rebranded as accidents. Gasps broke the air. One envoy tried to interrupt. The king raised a hand. Silence returned like a slammed door. When they threatened force, the king finally spoke, not loud, not dramatic. "If you touch her," he said, "you will not be avenged." It was not a boast. It was a statement of logistics. He listed consequences the way a builder lists materials. The rival king's envoys withdrew, faces tight, promises of return hanging like rot in the air. Everyone knew they would try again differently. After the hall emptied, she sat alone and felt the tremor in her hands. The king joined her and did not offer comfort. He offered respect. "You stood," he said. "They will escalate." She nodded. "So will I." For the first time, he smiled, not with warmth but with relief. The plan had worked because it was no longer his alone. Because escalation would not come as attack or treaty, but as a single blade sent for her in the night by someone who once called the king brother. The blade came from the dark the way lies always did, quiet, familiar, and wrapped in history. It was not thrown by an enemy screaming revenge. It was carried by someone who knew the corridors, the guards, the pauses between heartbeats. The king felt it a second too late, not because his senses failed, but because betrayal always wears a trusted face. The attacker stepped from the shadow wearing the sigil of shared blood, a brother not by love, but by oath, one of the few who had once stood beside the king when the throne was still wet with war. He did not aim for the king. He aimed for her, because power does not fear rulers, it fears symbols that cannot be controlled. She saw the movement before the guards did. Training did not save her. Choice did. She did not run behind the king. She stepped forward. The blade stopped inches from her throat, not by magic, not by force, but by recognition. The attacker hesitated, eyes flicking to the mark at her wrist, the proof that she was no longer invisible, that she was no longer a secret kept alive by silence. That pause cost him everything. The king disarmed him with a movement so precise it looked almost kind. No roar, no execution on the spot, just a hand on the man's shoulder and a quiet sentence that broke the room. "You taught me to rule without mercy," the king said. "Now watch me rule without fear." The traitor was not killed, he was exposed. His alliances were read aloud, his payments, his quiet trades of children and bloodlines disguised as peacekeeping. The court did not shout, they listened. That was worse. When he was taken away, stripped of name and protection, the hall felt cleaner, like rot had finally been cut out. She stood there shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had just survived by standing instead of hiding. Afterward, the king did something no one expected. He opened the gates, not to armies but to witnesses. He let the valley see her, not as a rescued girl, not as a possession, but as proof that gold does not get the last word. He returned to the family estate alone and did not bring soldiers. He brought gold. He placed it on the table exactly where the ledger once lay and asked the same question again, calm as stone. "If I give you this back," he said, "would you sell her again?" They answered too quickly. Greed always does. The king nodded once and left. The gold stayed. So did the consequences. By morning, creditors came. By night, no one helped. By winter, the house stood empty, not burned, not cursed, just unwanted. They were buried by their own answer. She never went back. She did not need closure. She had clarity. The king did not crown her. He did not claim her. He did not rewrite her story into romance. He gave her land, protection, and something rarer, a voice that did not need permission. When other courts whispered, when other rulers watched, the king stood where he always had, between her and the dark, not as a savior, but as a witness to what happens when someone who was priced learns their worth. The story spread, not as a warning but as a question whispered in markets and halls. What happens when gold fails? What happens when a king refuses to buy people and instead pays debts? She stood on the edge of the valley at dawn, looking out, no longer owned, no longer hidden. The king remained behind her, facing the wars he had invited by choosing truth over convenience. Neither looked back. If you enjoyed this story and want more dark, powerful tales where choice matters more than rescue, subscribe to Vampire Verse, like the video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next legend. Question of the day. If you were in her place, would you have walked away forever? Yes or no?